Hi everyone, my name is Alex and it's a Drake Poetry Night thing. If jumping to conclusion was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have been just now one. If jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just now won me, my heart. If jumping to conclusions wasn't Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just now won my heart. But you would have now just one gold. If jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have now just won. Just now, you wouldn't have you just now won my heart, but you would have now won just gold. If jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have now just wouldn't wanted to want my heart, but you would have now wanted just to have the one gold. If jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have my heart won now just, but you would have won now just one. You wouldn't have my heart had, but would have won just now you gold. If jumping to conclusion was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just now, but you would have won gold. If jumping to conclusions wasn't Olympic sport, you wouldn't have now you just won my heart, but would have now won gold. If jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just one. That's a mouthful. If jumping to conclusions in your jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just would have, but you wouldn't have just won my heart, but would have won my heart. If jumping to conclusion was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just won, but would have won a gold. Jumping, if jumping to if jumping and jumping, if jumping to conclusion was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just won my heart, but had what you have just won. If jumping, if in a jumping and conclusion was if jumping to conclusion and and if jumping to conclusions was an Olympic sport, you wouldn't have just won my heart, but would have now just won the gold.